Ignorance makes people similar, but turns them into enemies. Knowledge makes people different, but brings them together for a conversation. This book, Jews and Ukrainians, is an attempt to overcome mutual ignorance, provide some basic knowledge, and bring Jews and Ukrainians together for a conversation. Not only does the book tell Jews about Ukrainians and Ukrainians about Jews, it tells Jews about Jews and Ukrainians about Ukrainians. But why do Jews and Ukrainians need all that? Because representatives of both people know as little about themselves as they know about the other. The ignorance on both sides is astounding. Jews do not know that Ukraine was home to great rabbinic scholars, as Adrian mentioned, Hebrew and Yiddish writers, and major Jewish thinkers and politicians, to great ideas and concepts that govern Jewish life till today. Ukrainians do not know that Jews made Ukrainian villages into towns and towns into cities, developed the Ukrainian market economy, and inspired key Ukrainian thinkers to think differently about Ukraine. In addition, both Ukrainians and Jews are ignorant of the fact that Jews and Ukrainians in Odessa are cosmopolitan, in Kryvyi Rih and Dnipro, business-oriented, in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia-oriented, and in central and western Ukraine they celebrate Ukrainian-oriented ethno-cultural identities. Ukrainians do not know that Ivan Dzyuba was inspired by Zeev Jabotinsky. Jews do not know that Nathan Birnbaum, who invented the word Zionism, was actually inspired by the Galician movement of Ruthenian Ukrainian revival. Ukrainians do not realize that Jesus was Jewish. Jews do not realize that Tevye the milkman was Ukrainian. Jews ignorant of their own history and culture look and sound very similar to Ukrainians who are ignorant of their own culture and history. The person who says that Ukrainians were killing Jews during World War II is as ignorant as the person who says that Jews brought communism to Ukraine. Both statements prey on reductionism and generalization. Of course, there were individual members of the Ukrainian auxiliary police together with Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, and Russians. There were many communists of Jewish descent active in Ukraine together with communist Russians, Georgians, Poles, Germans, and Ukrainians active in Ukraine at the same time. But one cannot take several individuals for an entire people. That would be too easy and comforting. Knowledge starts when people ask questions to avoid easy, comforting, and simplified answers. This book on Ukrainians and Jews seeks to bring the two people together by creating a realm of knowledge between them, a bridge over a dangerous abyss of ignorance, reductionism, and generalizations. The authors of this book are very different people. Paul Robert Magaci was born in the United States and raised in a Protestant family of Central European, mostly Hungarian origin. Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern was born and raised in the Soviet Union by a family of Jewish origin, although in a totally secular environment. However, in addition to their shared professional interest in Ukraine, there was an important moral factor that brought the two authors together. I'm addressing the question. Both authors were committed to overturning generalizations, to shunning reductionism, and to seeking new knowledge about the two peoples. Moreover, and most importantly, they were convinced that only a people who knows thyself can understand and respect the other. The book Jews and the Ukrainians gives precisely the type of knowledge that teaches self-respect and respect for different people living in our midst. Hence, the book is based on the key idea of knowing thyself as a member of a people, as an individual related to that people. Understanding difference requires something more than received wisdom. Most Jews know about Ukrainians precisely what Ukrainians know about Jews. Received wisdom, which is stereotypes, of course. Jews were the lackeys of the Polish Szlachta and magnates and subservient agents of the Bolsheviks. They were behind the Russian Revolution and they were Russian-oriented, staunch Ukrainophobes. They may not have masterminded the Holodomor, but some Jews certainly did. And they continue blaming Ukrainians worldwide for the World War II atrocities of that Ukrainians never initiated nor carried out. For Jews, in turn, Ukraine was the center of the European bloodlands from the time immemorial. Jewish history in Ukraine was one prolonged pogrom. Ukrainians are Jew haters like nobody else in Europe, worse even than the Poles. You can laugh. They massacred Jews en masse during the Cossack Revolution. Haidamach massacres, the revolutionary upheavals of the early 20th century. Furthermore, the 300 years from the 1640s till the 1940s show that whenever Ukraine becomes independent, it turns virulently anti-Semitic and kills its Jews. Such stereotypes are passed from generation to generation through oral history, legends, and family stories. They are sometimes inspired by political propaganda, not always of Jewish or Ukrainian making. These stereotypes are powerful, entrenched, and taken for absolute, obvious, and undeniable truth. Questioning this truth is tantamount to leaving or betraying someone's ethnic identity. Any discussion of Ukrainian-Jewish relations has these stereotypical views in the backdrop. Whoever works in the Ukrainian Jewish historical field has to keep in mind that the interlocutor is always ready to say, really, this is not what I have learned. Precisely here enters the historian. To question a stereotype, to discuss the nuances, to introduce complexity into the discussion. Not necessarily to dismiss stereotypes as altogether false. A historian begins with questioning, challenging generalizations. You are saying that Ukraine was a land of martyrdom for the Jews. Why then was it home to a quarter of world Jewry, and why did Jews keep moving until the end of the 19th century to Ukraine, not from it? Well, Ukrainian nationalists were allegedly staunch anti-Semites. How about Yaroslav Dashkevich, Miroslav Marinovich, Yevhen Sverstyuk, Zinovy Antonyuk, accused by the Soviet regime of Ukrainian nationalism? Why did these people champion Ukrainian Jewish rapprochement and defend the Jews as an ethnic group with a unique culture to the xenophobic Soviet authorities? Why were they the very people who inspired assimilated Jews and Jewish dissidents in the Gulag to look at themselves as representatives of the Ukrainian Jews with a strong national democratic agenda? Stereotypes are not only misleading, they are dangerous, as they govern people's decision-making. Questioning stereotypes thus influences what people do in realm of everyday life and also in politics. Questioning makes people revisit their patterns of behavior and modes of thinking. Questions can be unsettling and quite challenging. Take the example of the 1919 pogroms, for which Simon Petlura, the chief Ottoman of the Ukrainian People's Republic, is often blamed. To orchestrate mass violence against any ethnicity, one has to have power over a territory where a targeted minority lives. Loyal troops following commands to commit atrocities and trained to do so. Political, religious, or ideological motivation channeled to the troops, and so on. But here a historian tells you that Petlura had none of these, that his power stretched over a railroad through which his train moved from Kiev to Fasti, and that he himself was a staunch Philo-Semite who had defended the Jews against Russian anti-Semites before 1917, and who had taken Jews into the Ukrainian government and promoted them to positions of influence after 1917. What would you say about Petlura's responsibility for the mass violence against Jews in the territory of Ukraine of 1919? This book on Ukrainians and Jews does give an answer, but it also invites disagreement and debate. It invites you to think and talk about hot issues in a new framework in which words burn but do not wound. It took hundreds of books, articles, newspapers, and unpublished documents to write this book. Yet, this book is a footnote-free narrative. It might seem an easy read, but it is often puzzling and unsettling. It appears like an encyclopedic book about the national geography, ethnic and cultural complexity, historical experiences, literary and artistic specificities, linguistic and religious differences of Ukrainians and Jews in or from Ukraine. Implicit, sometimes explicit. it unsettles the reader's stereotypical perception of the subject matter, challenges their expectations, and offers an alternative narrative on each and every cultural historical aspect of Ukrainians and Jews. It does so by introducing complexities, inviting nuances, and teaching the reader to question his or her own stereotypes. This book is much more than a history of two neighboring people who lived together and apart for over a millennium. Over the last 25 years, Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine revolutionized their self-understanding. The existence of the State of Israel had played a formidable role in this revolutionary process. Both peoples, Ukrainians and Jews, realized that their attempt to know their own history, culture, religion, and language was at least frowned upon and often simply suppressed before 1991. Both people regained their desire to explore their past and to build a common future. Both peoples realized that their common future depends on their ability to understand and respect one another as full citizens in a democratic polity. And both peoples found that they must actively oppose multiple attempts to negate their rights as a distinct polity, language, and culture. Neo-imperialistic policy toward Ukraine seeks to reduce the country to some of the ugly stereotypes already mentioned. On a political level, this book on Jews and Ukrainians teaches how to respond to imperialist Putin, excuse me the name, Ukrainophobic and anti-Semitic propaganda and its widespread cliches. The book teaches how to defend the intellectual, linguistic, cultural sovereignty of a people, and how to build a parallel narrative that brings the sovereign people and its immediate neighbor together. The neighbor who, according to imposed or inherited animosity, had been presented as an enemy alien. In this sense, this book is not only about Jews and Ukrainians. It is as much about Ukrainians and Poles, Poles and Germans, Chinese and Indians, Tutsis and Hutus, Turks and Armenians, as it is about Jews and Ukrainians. In this sense, the book teaches the responsibility, our intellectual responsibility to know the other. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe, Adrian, what you are doing right now, you are continuing the line of the book. You are telling us that there is definitely a shared history. Stalinism went as much against the traditional Jewish culture as it went against the national ethnic-oriented.
So that people can see you, because otherwise I don't get off.
Okay, so I'll move a little bit this way. Is this better? I never knew that.
And if you can't see us, just minutes in here.
Can you stand, please?
Can't you stand? Yes, we can stand. We'll just do it standing. But we thought we would have more fun.
Yeah. Why don't you stay there? I'd rather be staying here. And then,
So it's like a tango.
Right. Gladly. So, look. Let me repeat what I just mentioned. There is definitely an attempt in the book to present the Ukrainian narrative and the Jewish narrative, Ukrainian history and Jewish history, as two parallel narratives that have more to share than not. One of the aspects is, of course, Stalinism that goes viciously against Ukrainian traditional culture and also against Jewish traditional culture. Historians know that. Many historians wrote about that. Few historians discussed that at length. Almost nobody, except Paul Robert Markovich and Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, put it on paper as an attempt to create two parallel narratives. There is very little understanding among the Jews and among the Ukrainians, ordinary Jews, ordinary Ukrainians, that there is a parallel narrative. The idea of the book is to bring the readers from the Jewish readership and from the Ukrainian readership and make them read one and the same book and see how many, to what extent, this story is a shared history. I believe I'm addressing your question, but the underlying logic of this book is precisely the subject of the question and the style of the question. showing to what extent we are talking about a shared history.
So let me lay out a problem that exists in approaching Ukrainians on the issue of the Shoah, and that is that Ukrainians have not been part of the European discourse or the Western discourse on the Holocaust for these many years. They are not as sensitive to the consensus and the understanding that the Shoah was a unique attempt to eradicate an entire civilization, an entire people. And part of the reason for their, I wouldn't call it lack of sympathy, but lack of understanding, apart from not having been part of this discussion, they were cut off, is the fact that 2 million Jews roughly were killed on the territory of contemporary Ukraine during the Holocaust. But about 5 million Ukrainians died, several million in combat, and several million as civilian collateral damage under the Nazi occupation. So that the perspective of Ukrainians is that they also were major victims for many Ukrainians. They were major victims of the Nazi occupation. Add to that the fact of what Timothy Snyder writes in The Bloodlands, the idea that there was just mayhem from 1932 going through to 45, 46, where you had the Holodomor, the famine on the territory of Ukraine, which incidentally also claimed about 15,000 Jewish victims. How do you understand Ukraine's further evolution in understanding the Holocaust in a way that it should properly be understood, given those kinds of historical impediments where Ukrainians see themselves and don't quite see the distinction between, if they're Gentile Ukrainians, that their families were killed under the Nazi occupation, and that there should not be a special Jewish claim for understanding of their suffering.
Thank you. I believe it's quite clear that Jews were killed on the territory of Ukraine because they are Jewish. Ukrainians were killed on the territory of Ukraine for a variety of reasons. They might be pro-Bolshevik, they might be against the Nazis fighting for the Ukrainian nationalist units, many other reasons, but not a principal difference. And I'm ready to discuss the nuances of the differences and, of course, the ramification of understanding these differences. Speaking about Ukraine and the Holocaust of Ukraine, that's a big issue. It is a new issue. And it's a new issue because if I tell you that we have one book called The Shoah in Ukraine, the first attempt to bring different scholars together and think about what do we know about the field, you will tell me, no, it's impossible. Yes, it is possible. Most scholars who teach the Holocaust, who study the Holocaust, they think they are fine with German documents. Some of them are fine with Polish and German documents. Very few would like to go to the archives and study what actually happened on the ground in Ukraine, because it means another Slavic language. People do not want to do that because they think, oh, of course, Ukrainians, they are barbarian people. They kill the Jews because this is who they are. This is one of the most dangerous, I would say, catastrophic stereotypes that we have to deal with. When I say we, I mean myself, sitting at the table over Shabbat with a Jewish family, with a Rabbinic Jewish family in New York, Chicago, or Boston, and I mentioned that I go to Ukraine and I teach at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and the Rebbitzin tells me, oh, you teach those anti-Semitic? You can laugh, but I would not. We deal with the people who have the stereotypes. We have to work with that. You cannot dismiss it once and forever. Many scholars who study the Holocaust only recently realize they need the Ukrainian language. They need to know what is going on the Ukrainian side to understand what actually was going on there. I had a conversation, you mentioned Timothy Snyder. I had a conversation with Timothy Snyder 2 weeks ago. He was at Northwestern presenting his brand new book, Black Earth. And Timothy says that it is also a stereotype of the German scholars who think they can write about the Holocaust in East Europe looking just at German sources. So we just recently started to understand there is a very powerful Ukrainian story to tell. And this story is not necessarily about collaboration on the one hand of the bad Ukrainians, or about suffering. There are 7 million Ukrainians, 5 to 7 million Ukrainians who perished between 1939 and 1945. There were several hundreds, maybe several thousands who collaborated, but collaboration is also a complex phenomenon, and I'm ready to discuss that in the subsequent questions. But there are many more Ukrainians who were there in Ukraine during the Second World War. Do we know their story? Do we have a single English language book that tells the story of these people? Well, we actually have one, written by Karl Burkhoff. How many people know about the book? So that is, well, Glenn Diner knows about it, of course. Glenn Diner, Mike Ruth, and my colleague from Brandeis University, we studied together under Anthony Polonsky. Glenn is a professor of Jewish history and culture at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. So Glenn knows the book. My point is very simple. There are many things we need to get to know. And I hope what the book is doing, what the book that Paul Robert Mavich and I wrote, we are trying to tell you these are the questions to ask. These are the issues to think through.
Okay, so let's one more question on this dark chapter in the history of Ukraine's territory, the territorial history of Ukraine. Your sister is a prominent author who's won an award called for a book called Simply Esther, won the Ingvar Bachman Prize and many others, and she deals with a very complex history of your own family, including assassins and revolutionaries and people who suffered in the Holocaust. And it's a very complicated history. There are other people in this room who shall remain nameless who also were on different sides of the totalitarian history of Ukraine. And my question is, especially with regard to the Holocaust, how do you see Ukraine's leadership, Ukraine's society now coming to terms and acknowledging the events of the past? You mentioned that there's very little research in English and in general among scholars, but what about you follow Ukrainian discourse? You are regularly lecturing there, you're communing with both Jewish and non-Jewish scholars. How is Ukraine moving towards, is Ukraine moving in the same direction? I mean, Poland moved very painfully towards acknowledging some of its dark past. Germany moved with more fully and nimbly and became kind of the exemplar of a nation that tried to honestly deal with its past. Where is Ukraine on this spectrum of understanding?
I believe most of Ukrainian intellectuals who I know, people who publish books, who do research, who teach informally the adult audiences, who write about history in the newspapers, have this new, very complex, nuanced understanding of how to deal with issues related to, for example, collaboration, related to the Holodomor. I would also mention that many, I would say dozens and dozens of local Ukrainian historians who write books about the history of this place, the history of that place, Бурятия, Jabotyne, Vinnytsia, Kamyanets-Podilsk, and so on and so forth. These people are really trying and make fantastic effort to integrate the history of local Jews into the story of the town, of the city. However, there is a resistance on the level of the Ukrainian educational establishments, where you have scholars who in the 1980s taught the history of Marxism and the history of the Communist Party. And after 1991, they started to teach the history of Ukraine. And since they were, by and large, quite narrow-minded people, and I knew many of them, they were 1 teachers, it was very easy for them to switch from one narrow-mindedness to another narrow-mindedness. They're saying the history of Ukraine after 1991 is the history of ethnic Ukrainians. And they write books, they do research, they publish articles and books that have no Poles, no Russians, no Jews. There is Ukraine, so to say, that is Ukrainian history, which is written as the history of ethnic Ukrainians. Well, these people will go, majority of them will go, and they will be replaced by people who understand that Ukraine has always been the country which has its beautiful, interesting, complex, multi-ethnic history. And there are these new scholars, Tolochko, Kasyanov, who are coming to the fore and whose books become the standard textbooks of Ukrainian history. And these are new generation of historians and thinkers, and I am talking to them to begin with. It is, of course, the task of the Ministry of Education of Ukraine to eliminate those narrow-minded books that belong to the past, and, of course, encourage the writing of textbooks about Ukraine along the lines, let's say, of a standard English language textbook written by Paul Robert Bogachi, 1,000 pages, Ukraine, the land and its people. Oh, it's peoples, I believe it has. It has plural, very, very nice plural. So this is something that is